right, we're recording. This is the Assembly Ethics and Elections Committee. Today is Wednesday, June 22nd of 2022. And we'll start with introductions. I'm the chair, Pete Peterson.
Christopher Constant.
Suzanne LaFrance.
We have anyone on the phone?
No.
Okay, Miss Allard won't be here today, and she's accused. So let's go to our first item, the new business, and we're going to be getting an update from the Board of Ethics. Go ahead, Ms. Wynn-Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you all know who I am, but for the record, Becky Wynn-Pearson, the Chair of the Municipal Board of Ethics. I received the message that you guys just wanted a general update, so I prepared just a quick general update on the board, current state of the board, trends we're seeing, issues that we, that are percolating before us that may at some point rise to the point where we bring them to the Assembly. First, a quick review of the board current state. This is our current membership. As noted, I'm the current chair. I served on the board prior to serving as municipal attorney, so I was on the board for several years before as municipal attorney, and then returned after in the fall of 2021, fall of 2020. Our vice chair is Aisha Pallison. She's an attorney for the state of Alaska. I know you all are familiar with Terry Kelly from his role as chair. He's a professor of philosophy with a focus on professional ethics at the University of Alaska. We have Rabbi Ava Goodstein on the board right now. The rabbi to the congregation Beth Shalom, and our newest member, Joan Wilson, is also an attorney to the state. She's been a fantastic addition with a really deep knowledge of ethics and process issues at the state level. These are all of our expiration dates, so you'll have the need to confirm 2 new members or reconfirm our current membership in the fall of this year. Our current staff is Jennifer from the clerk's office and Megan is from the municipal attorney's office. I'll talk about this in a minute, but we've had some significant turnover in staffing in the past year. Our current meeting schedule, we meet the third Wednesday of the month and special meetings as required. First, a note on the major trend that we're seeing. This is the major thing that I think is notable about board activity over the past year is these numbers here, particularly this number. This is statistics back to 2017, which is when we adopted the current version of the ethics code in Title I. So there are stats from before this tier, didn't include them. Notably, I think the only one other year since 2006 where the board has had double digits in terms of requests. And this is a roll-up of both requests for advisory opinions, so self-generated by a public servant, and complaints for potential violation that are filed, with a question about a public servant's behavior or activities. So very notable, we had a doubling of our standard workload, doubling to tripling depending on the year in 2021. Common themes in that big year of requests. A lot of questions about conflicts of interest. I think part of the uptick was attributable to change in administration. So we had a lot of new people who were taking executive roles and either themselves asking about potential conflicts with their personal activities or their professional activities, or were having those questions raised by others on their behalf. Related procedural issues, questions about whether things have been disclosed appropriately and addressed appropriately. There's a lot of questions under the code about the distinction between a conflict of interest and a substantial conflict of interest, which I know you all are very familiar with, that you disclose if there's any conflict of interest, but you are only recused if it is a substantial conflict of interest. I know some question, people say, well, it wasn't substantial, so I didn't disclose it. That's a common question, a common issue that comes up. As I noted in casual conversation before we started, we have a lot of conversations also about, a lot of questions about what is and is not partisan or political activity. I think in our current political climate, a lot of questions about is something that a public servant doing an inappropriate use of municipal resources for partisan or political activity, and that's a big question. We have specific definitions in the code of what is partisan or political, and put those questions to the test in the last year. And then a final issue that kind of underscores all of this is the need for training. A lot of the questions, to the extent we have issued opinions where we've found violations or found issues, generally speaking, our remedy is training. People at issue maybe did not receive training when they stepped into their roles. We didn't have the resource to provide the training to make sure that everyone is aware of these restrictions and how they should play out. quick review of other issues and trends that are impacting the board right now. As I noted, staff turnover. We historically were staffed by Dee Ennis and Lisa Toussaint, and while Megan is fantastic and she has stepped into the role well, but as you all are aware, Dee had a lot of institutional memory and we had a lot of capacity when we had the two of them. So part of the question about training and handling the many, the increased requests for opinions of the board, it implicates the fact that we now have had turnover in staffing and a decrease in staffing for the board. And then last note is just code review. We're now 5 years into the new code, and I think we're starting as a board to see some areas where maybe we might want to ask for some or propose some revisions or tweaks or clarifications to the code. This is just a minor example, and many of these areas concern process, and I think they're particularly important right now because of the fact that we have so many people seeking access to process at the board. So this is an example here where this 2-line provision concerns what happens kind of on a due process basis when we accept a complaint for further review. So we have someone who's filed an ethics complaint against a public servant, and we've looked at the complaint on its face and said, yes, this on its face implicates the ethics code, so we're going to accept it for review. In the old code, the pre-2017 code, there was a pretty extensive set of provisions about exactly what we did with that, like who got to see the code and how confidentiality was protected and what we did in terms of process. All of those, for the purpose of efficiency, were compressed into this one line here, but that has raised questions for us about, okay, well, given that this is our one line of code direction, how do we as a board make sure that we are both protecting confidentiality of the complaint process, but also providing for due process for the respondent to a complaint to make sure that they are clearly and adequately able to defend against any complaint. They know the nature of the complaint against them. And similarly, I don't have this on the slide, but we have historically, in the old code, there was guidance for the board about when deliberations were to be conducted in executive session versus deliberative session. That is no longer present in the current code, so we have formally requested advice from the municipal attorney's office to help make that clear to us, and part of that may inform whether we think there's some edits that could be made to the current, that we might propose would potentially be considered to the code to make that clear. Again, all in the interest of making sure that we are following the code and that we are providing adequate and consistent process to both people who file complaints with the Board of Ethics and those who are respondents to those complaints. That is my summary. Any questions for me or about the activity?
Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Ms. McPherson. You mentioned the substantial conflict versus a not substantial conflict, and how we read the questions. Mm-hmm. And I hate the questions because they're really confusing. Mm-hmm. And I understand they have legal significance, but that's one thing that has come up a few times is I would really like to rewrite the questions. Mm-hmm. So that they're a little more clear, not just to the individuals and the members, but also to the public. And I don't know if that's something that the board would be involved. Yes? Okay.
I think to the extent you would want to refer that question to the board for our input, I think we would happily provide input into how, because it is something that we consistently deal with too, is how are we following the guidance in the code, and is the code guidance clear enough to help us really legitimately pull out those instances in which something is a conflict and is a substantial conflict and is not. So I think that to the extent that there's something we'd like the input of the board into that, it's a question we grapple with that we could add to our agenda for discussion and input.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Do you want me to follow up with an email?
Sure. That would be fantastic.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
We'll add it to our agenda.
Well, and when we updated the ethics code, 5 or 6 years ago, the questions never changed. They were still the same. They've been the same as long as I've been on the assembly, which is over 8 years now.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably time to take a look at those, and so that's something we should follow up on.
I would agree in that they don't ever seem to really capture the nature of the conflict because they're so specific towards certain types of conflict, and the conflicts that we see don't tend to be those. And so it's definitely something we might want to role play around and talk about scenarios where people do have potential conflicts and how questions could get to the matter. The questions we have most often don't.
Through the chair, is the issue that the questions are very focused on the financial conflict, and you're thinking there's more like the how do we embody? I think to us the question of when you have a personal conflict as opposed to a financial conflict is always the one that is the most confusing to people. So I don't have a financial interest at play here,
Right.
and then we have to kind of unpack the other elements of what a conflict is. That the concern? Or
I
you?
think we'd have to scenario it out with real-time conversation because it's both. It's both. Often when it is a personal financial or a professional financial, it's easy, yes, but most of the scenarios don't fit cleanly into that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, an example, I have a real estate license.
Mm-hmm.
I have a broker. My license is on referral status, meaning I don't really do any business. But when her business comes before us, it's attenuated. But I tend to say, no, I don't take any action on items that are related to her because there's some relationship here. Those questions don't really get there because there is no financial benefit that accrues to me. There's no personal benefit that accrues to me, right? It gets into that perception area where it's like,
Well, and one of the persistent questions in the code has been the matter of kind of the appearance of conflict or the appearance of unfairness, and the current code is drafted to say that that's insufficient to create a conflict of interest. But that's something that I know the board grappled with extensively, and I remember the assembly grappled with as well when we adopted the revised code. And so I think we have often also received complaints where we look at them and say, well, that doesn't feel right, but it doesn't specifically implicate the provisions of the code. So it sounds a little bit like that maybe what you're getting to too, is instances where you feel like it is inappropriate to participate in official action, but it doesn't specifically fit in the box that would prohibit official action.
and I think it's just the questions don't really get there.
Yeah.
And through the chair, we had a situation too where a member answered no to all the questions, but who had an interest, a substantial financial interest, but I think did not realize that was there in the questions.
Oh, interesting.
And so some of it I know too is members will seek guidance, talk to Mr. Gates or others in the Department of Law before raising the issue of it. But I have I have the questions here, and I don't know too, to your point, Chris, Mr. Constant, if there's some more framing as well, because it's, again, not just confusing to some of the members, but probably to the public who's there.
Certainly. So potentially through the chair to add maybe some introductory language to the format to say the purpose of the question was to assess, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then the code, and then, yeah. Okay.
Well, it's always, and I'll get to Ms. Jones in just a minute, when I was in the legislature, we got a little bit of training, ethics training, and the point that they made that I remember specifically was try to avoid even the appearance of a conflict, because if it appears like it's a conflict, whether there is or isn't, perception is reality, and so the public will potentially perceive that there's a conflict, whether there is or isn't. So you have to try not to get yourself in those situations if that's at all possible. Ms. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to point out pretty much what the members are saying is that when they go through the questions, especially with the personal conflict, and even using Christopher's example, and the answer is, well, no, I'm not gonna, but and this isn't Christopher, it was a member prior to this body said, I don't want to vote, it's my friend, but the answers were all no, and the assembly doesn't have the ability to be recused unless it fits that conflict definition. So they have that duty to vote under the code. So I think that's part of the rub, is that they may not want to vote because they believe, as Pete said, that it appears like a conflict, but the answers to the questions might be no. But then what do they do because the code requires them to vote? So I think that's part of the question that we should ask the board.
Right, and a specific one was, that I remember, was an individual, his parents owned a winery. The winery was up for licensure. It was his parents, you know, and they made a vote on it. And we made a vote on it. I would have said, hell no.
Well, and another thing that was totally different in the legislature is if you stand up and say that you have a conflict, all it took was one of the other members of the legislature to object
Right.
to you saying that you had a conflict, and then they required that you voted anyway, even if you did have a conflict. And so it's totally different than the way we've been doing it here on the assembly. Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you. I just had a couple of observations, I guess. And one thing that I think we forget sometimes is that our ethics code did something when we rewrote it. It said those appearances of conflict are governed by our new code, and supersede the common law. So we're in common law, and like you were saying, it just doesn't feel right. The appearance of impropriety is there, because that's my friend, and I like him, they're great, we're both buddies. But all the answers are no. I think in that scene 11520, that purpose, it's appearance of impropriety. See, it says, where provisions of this chapter differ from the common law principle that an appearance of impropriety alone is sufficient to establish a conflict of interest or an ethical violation, the provisions of this chapter supersede the common law. And I think that's why you find yourselves feeling uncomfortable, but it's allowed because of our objective questions and the financial interest questions. But maybe one thing missing, or I guess actually another point that I want to make is what I've seen in a lot of these is that not enough facts are already known, or we want more facts about exactly what's the relationship there. But I think that it's fair game for the person disclosing their conflict can be asked questions by the chair or presiding officer. And like you said, right, well, can you explain a little more your contract, your old friend, or what is it, what's going on? Or Chris, you have a mistake by saying the centers of the broker you work for, you don't work for, what's the for mean? You can ask questions to clarify. I'm not sure if that's like appropriate before you get to the 5 questions or after. And then one other thing I thought of here is we often see, I guess, maybe in the judicial context where an officer feels, well, I can't, even though I don't have an actual conflict based on those objective questions, subjectively I don't feel I can be impartial here. I like my buddy too much, you know, something like that. And maybe that's something that we could add to our list. I don't have the list of questions in front of me. In our code in 11560E, number 6 is other factors deemed appropriate by the presiding official and the specifics of disclosure and the nature of the action. So maybe actually there is that it's so, we're so non-impartial. Oh yes, the question's here. Okay, thank you. It's number 6. But maybe that's where we get to, and what I'm interested in hearing from your perspective, Becky, is it ever where all the answers are no, but just they're so tight, they're so close, they have such a personal relationship. My high school buddy from 30 years ago, I mean, I'm not revealing my age here, but could that be something that just supersedes it despite that purpose that I read at the beginning? And I mean, that's a really subjective thing. Those other questions are pretty objective. You know, I don't benefit from approval here financially. No, it's subjective part. So still have a play here.
Through the chair, I think that's a challenging question and one we grapple with at the board too. And honestly, we have at times kind of shoehorned some concerns into that. There's a mention at the beginning of the code about the protection of public trust. And so sometimes we have used that provision to say, well, this is potentially specifically within the definition of conflict of interest, but this is a violation of the public trust, which is protected separately under a different provision of the code. But it is a core challenge, I think, in the code rewrite that the conflict provision is written relatively narrowly. And I mean, mean, there is clearly the space in the questions as drafted in the code to deal with those other factors deemed relevant by the chair, but I think this is, we're identifying a rub in the code that we grapple with at the board level as well, because there are many situations that appear improper when you're thinking about principles of good government, but do not specifically fall in the code the way it is drafted. So I think it's a good question. I also think the code should be user-friendly. So to the extent that there's questions that we pull out of it, they should be something that can be used in the form that they're drafted, so for new boards and new assemblies to use in a way without having to root around for a different provision to potentially justify having someone allow themselves to recuse from a matter. So I think it is a good task to take on now to consider whether the question should be amended.
If I could ask, in that recusal, I think sometimes you see members wanting to recuse themselves, and sometimes I or someone else reminds them, well, in our code in Chapter 2, you have a duty to vote, and only the chair of the body can recuse you. But their statement that I want to be recused should be a factor, is what you're saying. That should be a big factor in that body's decision.
You probably have more history than I do. My recollection, vaguely, from 2017 is that based on Dee's history, we redrafted the code. Barbara, you may have history too, to try and narrow the instances in which people could recuse themselves, because there had been some concern that in controversial items, enough members would articulate a conflict that the bodies would be unable to take action. And so that was a factor at play in how the conflict language was drafted. I don't know how significant of a policy concern
my
that
sense
is.
from that rewrite is it's sort of the instructions to err on the side of staying and voting,
Yeah.
and rather than erring on the side of accusing because it's controversial.
And that was informed at the board level, like that when we were working on our reduff that went to be something for consideration by at that time a sense that we wanted to encourage enough members of the body to remain present to allow for voting on matters even that were very controversial.
I get that sense too. I think that was actually wise, the small bodies.
But on the other hand, if a person feels conflicted themselves, and they put themselves in a difficult situation if they're required to vote on something when they don't feel they feel that they actually do have a conflict, then you fall into that gray area. I mean, and unfortunately, a lot of this is not necessarily black and white all the time. It's in that in between area, and so that's why we've created 5 or 6 questions or whatever it is. And so it probably makes sense that we take a look at those questions again, since we actually haven't done that in a number of years, I would imagine. So, all right, well, fantastic. Are there other questions for Ms. Wynn Pearson while she's here, or ideas, about further things that we as a committee might want to the Board of Ethics to take a look at?
Well, I don't know.
Mr. Costin?
I think you want you to look at this, but it may be landing on you pretty soon, a new code section under ordinance AO 2022-60S, which establishes a procedure for the removal of executive or elected service board members. And one of the methodologies is parallel to the method that exists under the Title II, the legislative branch. And so it doesn't really change the functions and methods and tasks, except for it takes on more of the municipal governance into its umbrella. And so it's definitely something that we'll be hearing again on the 12th. And after that, should it pass, it's certainly something that the Ethics Board should make itself familiar with.
So have you been following that? Have you taken a look at that piece of that ordinance at all?
Not closely. I haven't read the ordinance itself. I've just been following coverage of the process. But I will take that under advisement and go back and make
Yeah,
sure
there's a
that
previous section where the ethics board is one of two entities that can
Can
file
recommend.
such an action. And so it would be the same in the code section.
All right. Any other questions or items for business right now? Or we can move down to old business. Any old business that we need to take a look at?
So my standard, Mr. Chair, is there is no old business on the agenda because old business, according to Robert's rules, is business that was already dispatched. It's unfinished business. But that said, in the category of unfinished business, we had an election, and I would love an election report.
Oh, okay. Well, Jamie is here. Ms. Hines, would you like to give us an election update?
Sure. Yep, election day was yesterday. We mailed out 37,000 ballots. As of last night, we'd only received about 4,000 back. We received 417 today, which was a little surprising. Again, we had about 300 from drop boxes, or 350 from drop boxes, and only about 15 from the mail. So that was pretty surprising for me. So fairly low voter turnout. I would assume that voter fatigue and voter confusion potentially played a lot into it. Everything that we had received as of yesterday morning and was adjudicated as good was counted and processed and included in the results from last night. And the 400 and whatever that we received today is currently being opened and scanned and will be adjudicated and posted this evening. And then from now on, from tonight on, we'll post as we can. We do have to keep their safety in numbers as far as making sure that somebody's vote you can't see where somebody voted. You want to keep the numbers a little bit bigger. I think that's all I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do you know how many military and overseas ballots were sent out?
We sent out 123 military and overseas.
Well, they could still be coming back in
Yes.
for a while yet then.
Correct. Yep. Public session of Canvas is scheduled for Friday, July 8th, and certification is scheduled for Tuesday, July 12th.
And so we'll be having a new member on the assembly starting on July 12th.
Yep.
We'll have a full dais at that point.
So I want to drill down slightly into these numbers because it's little moving parts. So I think we had 3,800 in the spreadsheet that went out this morning, right? So roughly 3,800, maybe 3,880 or something, right around there. And then that was through yesterday morning. And so the 417, that includes everything that came in yesterday.
The 417 is what we received today.
So what about the ballots between yesterday morning and yesterday evening?
So we only pick up from the drop boxes in the morning. So we picked all of them up we went in the morning and then we went again at 8 p.m.
So the 8 p.m. ones are counted as today.
Yes.
And so that basically, from the 3,800, we can add the 417 or so, plus the potential 100 overseas ballots, and then whatever might come in by mail over the next couple of days, or that slow trickle that happens.
Yes.
So we're looking at roughly 417. There was about 100 ballots different between those that were counted and those that were received. And so were those 100 just processed today?
There are issues. There's
Questions.
signature match
Gotcha.
questions.
Okay.
No signatures that we're trying to collect from the Division of Elections.
Gotcha. Okay, so then the number that was counted was all of the 3,800 minus any potential issues,
Yep.
plus then the 417, plus any that might trickle in. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So So do we have any kind of a line of people voting in person at all yesterday? Do we know?
There were 20 voters in person yesterday here at City Hall.
20.
Total?
I don't believe
Yeah.
there were 44 ballots. So 20 people brought their ballots into City Hall to the silver drop box, and 20 were actually processed.
Okay.
So a thought for the future, you and I had a couple emails on the topic. When we have an area-specific election, I think it's wise that we communicate broadly that where ballots will be accepted, where you can vote in person, right? Because I know I heard a lot of people, a lot being a handful because it's a small election, I was reaching out, that were planning to go to the library. And the library is everyone's default place to go. In an election, in the back of their mind, that's just where they know there's always going to be. And so we might figure out a culture shift to help people understand that always it will be at City Hall, right? Not always at the library. Some way to communicate that for those region-specific elections.
Yeah, so interestingly, we just did an RFP for our print and mail vendor, and they have a feature which they call the wrap, which is it's another piece of paper that they fold up and put in there, and it gives them a QR code that will take to a web page where they can find the 5 closest drop boxes and also the closest ABC to their location based on their residence address. So that might
It'll
be
be
a
helpful.
solution.
It'll be helpful, and it might also be helpful since we have them, even though it's a bit of a pain to always have one at the library, just not a vote center, but a drop box. You know, that, and then on the Dropbox, even though it's got a specific wrap, we might be able to publish some information as well, that QR code or some other tool. I know that I spent the last week telling people you can vote in person at City Hall every day until the election, not knowing, of course, not thinking we had a holiday, but still, for the most part, that was the message at the end. You can vote in person every day at City Hall. And it was missed. A lot of people didn't know this. And so that raised my level of anxiety a little.
We learn new information from every election,
Absolutely.
and now that I hear that people were missing the LUSAC, I think back and I think it's always been we've always used the LUSAC one for even for both regulars, runoffs, and specials because that's been closest to that district. And now that, you know, in my election worker brain, the LUSAC is way outside of that district, and why would you travel so far away from home to go vote? But that's where they're used to, then
Tradition.
it does make sense.
Training, conditioning, yeah.
People have it, you know, and so that's where they voted before, that's where they're going to go the next time. Ms. LaFran.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious, and thanks for the update, Ms. Hines. How many observers have there been for this election?
We had 0 observers registered until yesterday, and I think we're up to 8 over yesterday and today.
Are those spread pretty evenly among the different campaigns?
Nope, they're all for the Stephanie Taylor campaign.
Okay, thanks.
8 for one campaign?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and I just happened to think of a question. You know, I received emails from a couple of people that were all worried about how much confusion there was between the special congressional election and the special 12th seat election. And so did we, how many ballots do you know did we get in our drop boxes that were congressional ballots? Did we get a lot of those?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it was over 1,000. We put together a team on June 11th to go close the drop boxes and pull out the state ballots, and then we immediately reopened them again so that they had their 8 o'clock cutoff on June 11th, and it was 1,200 state ballots in that pickup on June 11th. I think there were 60-some municipal ballots in that. And there were 50 to 60 throughout the rest of the days that had been out there. And we worked with the state to transfer ballots back and forth, both ways.
Right, well, and we've been cooperating with the state on elections forever, so it's nothing new. And my answer to the people's questions was that the ballots are different. You can tell as soon as you look at them. You don't have to open them or tear them apart. You can just look at the ballot and say, well, that's a state ballot. You know? So it's not like there's going to be some confusion, and they're not going to be counting the state ballots for the local race and vice versa. So interesting. But yeah, then there you go. People are used to dropping the ballots in the same drop box, and so that's we got them trained a little bit. So maybe that's sort of a good thing, you know.
Yeah.
Mr. Constant?
What's good is that we do have that collaborative relationship, and I just want to give you much credit for having staffed at 8 p.m. on election day for the state election, because I had a moment of panic when I realized, oh my God, you know, there could be a bunch of ballots that never get counted because they sat in one of our drop boxes, but you clearly thought that through.
Yep.
And so much credit to the team, and thank you.
Yes.
And separate from that, on the big picture, thank you for running a good, clean election.
Oh, yeah.
You guys did a great job, and we'll talk more about that when we certify this election. And it was much credit to the whole team that Barbara was at the assembly meeting last night, not at the election center. And so thank you for being the leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually a little surprised to see Ms. Jones at the meeting last night. But, you know, as I thought about it a little bit, I thought, well, that just shows confidence in Ms. Hines and the election team that we have put together and trained. And, you know, the fact that they, had experience just an April election, there was probably many of the same people were working this special election that worked that election, I would imagine. So
A lot of our 60 workers from the regular election also worked the state election. So there was some coordinating with with the state. Sometimes they would come in and work for us in the morning and then go over in the afternoon to the state. But it worked out very well.
All right, fantastic. All right, do we have any other topics for discussion? Not seeing any. I guess we'll see if there's anyone in the audience that would like to participate. Do we have anyone online that wants to participate and make any comments? If you're calling on your phone, it's *6 to unmute.
We don't have the phone. I didn't connect the phone.
Oh, okay. Well, then people won't be commenting on the phone today. Okay. So, well, I want to thank Ms. Wynn Pearson for giving us her report today. And I guess we are adjourned, so we can go out and enjoy this beautiful Alaska summer that we have today.